My Hero Academia, all grown up. Chapter 40. Uraraka tried to keep the smile off her face as she watched Bakugou sling a fluffy red towel over his shoulder before zipping up a backpack full of beach supplies. She let her eyes linger on his exposed arms and didn't realize that he had caught her doing it. Got something to say? She was shocked back to reality and blushed madly when she met his gaze. Nope. Bakugou smirked at her before he tossed the other red towel her way. She didn't bother trying to catch it in her embarrassment, so it flopped down over her head. Let's go. The beach is only a few minutes' walk. Uraraka bundled up the towel and smoothed down her hair before following him excitedly. She hardly slept the night before in anticipation of going. Something about wading in the water and soaking up the sun sounded like the stress-relieving thing she needed. She couldn't help the skip in her step as Bakugou locked up the house and led her down a cracked sidewalk. The houses on either side matched his family's house in age and vintage adorableness. The area was slightly overgrown and weather-worn while rusty. Old lawn decorations gave a subtle reminder of decades past. As they passed a bright yellow house, she spotted an old couple rocking in wicker chairs on the porch, while one of them read the paper. The old woman had a glass of iced water in one hand, and she used her other to wave at them as they passed. Uraraka eagerly waved back with a smile, but Bakugou simply rolled his eyes. Uraraka elbowed him teasingly. Don't be rude. I don't fucking know them. Bakugou shrugged her off, but his tone didn't have any bite to it. He could feel an ocean breeze stirring in between the houses now, so he knew they were close by. There aren't very many people around. Uraraka frowned as she glanced up and down the old beach town street. Bakugou glanced at her. It's the off-season for tourists. School started back up a while ago. Uraraka hummed in recognition before she skipped ahead with a bright smile. Oh, Katsuki. Look. He didn't move any faster, but after a few long strides, he saw it too. The morning tide had come and gone, leaving the beach looking refreshed and inviting. Uraraka had already run down the sand, shedding her towel and purse on the soft sand. She stopped a few feet before the relaxed waves and kicked off her favorite sandals, smiling as she stepped forward and let the shallow water wash over her ankles. She shrieked in surprise before jumping back to the dry sand. Ooh, that's cold. Bakugou smirked at her while he wandered up to her abandoned towel and slid the backpack off. It's the ocean, dumbass. She tossed a half-hearted scowl over her shoulder at him. I guess I just thought it would be warm enough to swim. Bakugou shook out her towel before he laid it flat over the sand. It's still early in the morning. It'll warm up by lunch. The brunette huffed a sigh before turning around and scooping up her sandals. So, what are we going to do until then? Bakugou went to work on laying his own towel out as she came back to join him. Whatever we fucking want. It's supposed to be a vacation. Well, she knelt down next to him and poked his shoulder. You don't seem like you're in a vacation-y mood, mister. He jerked his head and paid her a grim look. What the fuck is that supposed to mean? I'm in a great mood. Emichim. Uraraka dropped her but down on her spread-out towel and adjusted the thin faux silk robe tied around her waist. It was a dark blue with an elegant cherry blossom print that complemented her skin tone and made her feel like she was wearing something expensive. The trim was her favorite part about it, though, a bright gold braid that sat stark against the blue. Bakugou brushed off her teases as he settled onto his own towel and considered pulling off his black tank top, but decided against it. Instead, he reached for the backpack and opened it up to dig out a few things. Do you want some breakfast? You brought food? Uraraka raised her eyebrows at that and watched in wonder as he delivered a small package into her hands. She could smell the eggs and furicake through the enclosed lid, and she smiled. You made this? Yeah. He shrugged and pulled out a second one for himself. They both opened up the paper containers, and he smirked to himself at Uraraka's shock. She stared bug-eyed at the well-prepared breakfast, and he felt a small swell of pride. Whoa! She breathed and blindly accepted the chopsticks from him. When? We only had the leftovers from last night, so... She trailed off, confused. Bakugou took a bite, chewed, and swallowed before answering. I brought some ingredients back after my workout this morning. Now the brunette was beyond confused. What? You worked out this morning? He tossed her an obvious look. Of course I fucking did. I never skip a day, not even for a vacation.
When?
I don't remember you getting up. She sputtered back at him and sat frozen, her food still untouched. Bakugou looked down at his own meal and shrugged nonchalantly. I tried to get you up, but you fucking snapped at me to leave you alone. I did not. Her eyes widened as she protested in embarrassment. I mean, no, I didn't. Her tone went soft as she raked her brain to try and remember. She vaguely recalled Bakugou prodding her shoulder, but she was sure that she had dreamed telling him to buzz off and bother some other poor soul that was crazy enough to go for a run before the sun was even up. Bakugou shoveled another mix of rice and salmon past his lips and gave her a passive look. You're fucking grouchy in the morning, round face. Much scarier, too. Uraraka looked away from him with bright red cheeks and settled the food in her lap. The sound of the ocean rolling over the sand did little to calm her thoughts, but a subtle jab on her arm did. She sucked up her pride and whipped her head around. Oh yeah? At least I don't get up at the devil's hour to go work out by choice. I don't know how you run on so little sleep anyway. Bakugou scooped another bite into his mouth before looking down at her lap. You going to eat that or not? Yes. Uraraka snatched the food up defensively, but her eyes sparkled with a challenge. With a roll of his shoulders, Bakugou sunk down backward onto his elbows. Then fucking eat it before it gets cold. Uraraka pouted at him for a moment before turning away and looking down at the food. Had he really gotten up so early that he was able to work out, go to a market and make this breakfast before she even woke up? If so, she really needed to get her ass in gear if she wanted to raise her hero rank. Perhaps she should start taking a page out of his book. Oi, Bakugou called at her from his place. Don't get fucking weird right now. We're on vacation. A million thoughts ranging from frustration to dismay rushed through Uraraka's head, but only one was strong enough to be acted on. She turned a narrowed look onto him as she slowly raised the food and her utensils up. Weird. His teasing smirk fell away as he looked back at her serious expression. He licked his lips a few times and slowly sat up. Not like Dash. Weird.
Yeah, weird.
You know what I mean. Uraraka felt a tingle rush up her spine as she realized that she had him trapped. Oh, I do. Bakugou flushed slightly. Wait, what do you think I mean? Don't turn this around on me. Uraraka scoffed back at him and took an arrogant bite of her food. You're the one who said it. Bakugou wanted to make a smart comment about speaking with a full mouth, but it never graced his lips. Instead, he found himself searching for something to say that might help him escape the unbearable awkwardness of her condescension. Oh, I'm warning you. You don't want to start something that you can't finish. Who says I can't finish? Bakugou couldn't look at her. That comment made his entire body light up with tension, and her unintentional tone only made it worse for him. Round face. He turned his eyes toward the ocean and focused on aligning his breaths with the tide. Uraraka gave him an odd look as she re-examined the conversation in her mind, but after a few astonishingly long moments, her face reddened. Katsuki.
What?
He snapped and gave her a blunt look. Why, you made me say it. Bakugou let her punch his arm, but it didn't hurt. It was meant to be a tease, after all. He gave her a quirky smirk despite the suggestive topics that had crept into his head. Uraraka was too easy to tease, but every so often, she'd do a number on him that he wouldn't easily forget. This was one of those occasions, but he'd be damned if he let her know it. I don't even know what you fucking mean by that. Uraraka released a frustrated groan before pulling away and picking her food up again. Never mind. I didn't mean to say something so, well, you know. Bakugou sat up on his towel a little further and edged himself closer. Whatever, round face. You can only play that card for so long. I'll let this one go. C card. Uraraka frowned at him, but before he could reply something smart, a flock of seagulls swarmed the area and landed on the sand a few yards away from them. They were loud and bothersome, so Bakugou immediately stood up to shoo them away. Uraraka took the reprieve gratefully and tried to shovel as much food as she could in her mouth before it got cold. She'd been so wrapped up in the allure of him that she hadn't been able to take more than a single bite. Regardless, she blushed inwardly as she revisited the conversation in her mind. He was being especially bold during this trip. Perhaps he was truly serious about the comments he made last night. Before she had any more time to dwell on it, Bakugou had chased away the birds and sunk down on the towel again. We'll have to put on some sunscreen soon. It'll probably start to get pretty hot in another hour or so. Noticing the warmth of the sun on her skin, Uraraka nodded as she chewed. If this weather kept up, the chilly ocean water would feel good in no time. Perhaps getting there early was a good idea because who knew how many people would crowd the beach by the afternoon. And she didn't really mind her company either. I want to do some wakeboarding anyway. Bakugou had polished off his food and was beginning to clean up. I'm a fucking master at that shit. Her blush was entirely gone now and she glanced back at him. I've never been wakeboarding. Is it hard? Fuck no. Bakugou scoffed at her. Well, at least not for newbies. It gets hard when you've done it a million times and want to do some tricks. Uraraka poked at her meal. Oh, I'm sure. I'd like to try it, I think. Bakugou smirked. Care to make it interesting? No. Uraraka sniffed at him. That wouldn't be a very fair bet. He exhaled through his nose before rolling onto his back and shutting his eyes. The sun was beginning to feel quite warm on his skin, and he palmed around for the beach bag. His fingers found one of the straps, and he tried to yank it closer, but it didn't move. After a few curious pulls, it still refused to budge. He snapped open his eyes to investigate and found Uraraka mindlessly gripping the other strap with a smug grin. I need the sunscreen. He pulled again, but she held tight. Come on, round face. Ahem. She cleared her throat haughtily. I believe I have a name, Katuski. Bakugou narrowed his eyes as he sat up on his elbows. Round face, Uravity, annoying. It's all the same shit. Fine. Uraraka raised her chin a bit and yanked the bag her way. If it's all the same, then I think I'll go first. No fucking way. Bakugou pulled again, much harder this time. Uraraka's arm was jerked by his action, but she held firm before taking her turn again. Clearly, my skin is much more sensitive than yours. You would want me to burn, would you? This time, she activated her quirk on the bag and pulled especially hard. Bakugou found himself thrust up straight and he frowned. That's cheating. I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to. Uraraka replied with false innocence before using her free hand to untie the sash around her waist. The cherry blossom robe was relieved of its tension and fell open around her chest. After all, I think I have a little more skin to cover. Bakugou openly gawked at her, and his grip on the backpack's strap loosened enough for her to pull it completely out of his grasp. She smiled victoriously, but his gaze was fixed on her in a bold bikini. It was the perfect orange color that contrasted her skin tone and nodded toward his hero costume in a very subtle way. It worked out well for her, too, considering it was on sale at the department store she was shopping at in rushed preparation for their trip. Clearly, it was having the effect she was hoping it would. Bakugou sank back down on his elbows and consciously forced himself to look away. Of all the people to fight dirty. Uraraka hummed as she felt around the pack for the tube of sunscreen. What was that? Shut up. Bakugou's tone had no bite to it, and he turned his blush away. He palmed around him until his hands found his sunglasses, and he slid them onto his face, thankful that they would help mask his lingering glances at her. He couldn't help but smirk at how well she was playing him today. She'd pulled the sunscreen from the bag and let the robe fall off her shoulders, putting her swimsuit on full display. She never looked back at him once, while she rubbed the lotion into legs and slowly began working her way up her body. He tried hard not to watch, instead staring blankly at the waves rolling in a few meters in front of them. However, he was casually aware of his peripherals, and it took all his consciousness not to turn and look completely. Can you get my back for me? He was startled by her question, and his hands immediately clammed up. What? My back. Uraraka drew his attention, and she pointed behind her. I can't reach it. Will you help? Air dash. He cleared his throat and angled his body toward her, careful to hide his widened eyes behind the lenses of his glasses. Sure, whatever. He touched the bottle of sunscreen from her and twirled a finger. Turn around. Uraraka gave him a coy grin before slowly turning around and gathering up her hair so he could put some on the back of her neck. She felt a blush creep up her face as he scooted closer to her, but it disappeared the moment she felt a cold, wet spot in the center of her upper back. Katsuki. What? He asked in shocked annoyance. Uraraka twisted her head to look over her shoulder. You're not supposed to glob it on like that. Here. She turned a little more and grabbed the bottle from him. She deftly grabbed his right wrist and flipped it so the palm was facing up. Put it on your hands, and then on my back. Teach, he scoffed, and the sun glinted on the rim of his sunglasses. Whatever. You're the one that asked me to do this. She laughed lightly at him and shook her head teasingly. It's fine. It's just funny to me. He frowned at her, but motioned for her to turn around again. She complied and closed her eyes as he spread the cool lotion across her back and shoulders. He went fast at first, clearly unsure of how to handle himself, but after a few minutes, he began to rub it in slowly and carefully. He meticulously worked down her back until he reached her hips, and she found herself arching her back a bit in response to his hands, a blush painting her face. The back rub felt good, and she relaxed again as he worked his way back up to her shoulders. The sun felt warm on her bare skin as the morning lazily grew later, and she sighed contentedly. She didn't notice that his hands left her until another cool smear on the backs of her arms brought her back to the moment. You're just going to burn no matter what, Bakugou muttered, and she was awoken to how close he was. Uraraka didn't bother replying to that, silently agreeing with him. She was quite pale, and a day in the sun would be sure to leave her with a sunburn. Her arms went limp as he smoothed over them and over her shoulders again, accidentally tugging on the strap to her bikini. Sorry, he immediately blurted out, and they both blushed. He kicked himself for the outburst and tried to refocus on his task. When had he started acting so awkward toward her? This was Uraraka, so why was he being so weird? She shifted a little under his hands, and he realized that he'd stopped moving them. His curiosity had gotten the better of him. He shook his head and carefully let his fingers glide to her neck. He felt her tense for a brief moment before she relaxed and let his fingers slide upward to work in the last of the lotion. It felt strangely intimate and deliberate, and she rolled her head back a bit as he took the opportunity to massage down either side. He didn't say anything as he pulled his hands away to swipe his forefingers over the tops of her ears before sitting back on his heels. He smirked when she slowly turned around again to see that he was beginning to apply some on himself. He moved much faster on himself, working the sunscreen into his legs until he reached his black and red swim trunks. He raised his eyebrows over the rim of his glasses as he pulled his tank top off in one swift movement. Uraraka rolled her eyes and shook her head at him. You might look good, but I think I won this one. You think I look good? His smirk turned devilish as he began spreading the sunscreen over his arms. You always look good, Uraraka grumbled defeatedly and reached up to adjust her ponytail. He sniffed at that. For how much you complain about my ego, you don't seem to have any problem with inflating it. Oh, Katsuki. Uraraka let the words slide off her tongue as she scooted up to him. You do a good enough job inflating it all on your own. Bakugou knew she couldn't see his challenging gaze through the glasses, but movement behind her caught his attention. His eyes flicked up to see that a few other people were arriving on the beach, and he knew that if he wanted to tease her any further, it would be at his own detriment. At this rate, they wouldn't make it much longer on this beach before he would have to kiss her. His eyes snagged on two women that were propping up an umbrella a couple dozen meters away. They looked away from him the moment he turned their way, and he dropped his brows at that. It would be cocky for him to say aloud that they might have been checking him out, but that didn't seem like the right descriptor. He watched them for another moment as they stole curious glances back at him, only to turn away again when they noticed he hadn't looked away. He noted that as strange, but Uraraka didn't let me think about it much further than that.
What?
Uraraka cocked her head at him as she noticed his attention shift. She turned her head around to see the other arrivals on the beach. Oh, I guess this place isn't totally empty of people, is it? No. Bakugou hummed and let his eyes fall back on her. It's your turn now, oh. He tossed the sunscreen at her and smirked as she scrambled to catch it before turning around to show her his back. Be fast about it, would you? I don't want to burn. Uraraka squinted at him, although she knew he couldn't see it. You could say please, you know. I don't think you said please either, he waved his hand over his shoulder. Come on, we don't have all day. Uraraka popped open the cap and squeezed it over his back, letting fat drops fall down on him. He reflexively tensed at the cold sensation and hissed at her. You just gave me shit for that. I know. Uraraka slapped her hands against his back with a knowing grin and began to lather the lotion over his back. At first, she tried to make it seem like it was such a chore for her to do it, but once the lotion was spread over her broad shoulders, she slowed and put in some elbow grease. She pressed her thumbs into his shoulders to work out the unending supply of knots and tension. She smiled as he slumped forward and groaned as she went over tender spots, feeling pleased with herself for taking the time and effort to do it. By the time she had finished massaging his entire back, she had worked up a sweat. Gosh, it's getting a little hot out, isn't it? He didn't waste a moment before grabbing out a water bottle from the backpack. Here. He twisted himself around to find that she was still sitting up on her knees, a few breaths away from him. Her mouth pursed, resisting a smile at his dumb look before she knocked the bottle from his hand and pressed her fingers against his shoulder. I think I'd rather go for a dip. Wadash, he couldn't finish the word before he was floating and being pulled toward the water. Oi, round face, put me the fuck down. Nope. Uraraka hummed happily as she began to hurry down the shore faster. You're coming along. I'm not fucking around. He tried to maneuver himself in midair to grab at her, but she yanked him forward a bit, and it halted his effort. I don't want to get wet yet. Too bad, she sang at him and broke into a giddy jog. The sand turned soft as she hit the water, and she flung him out over the shallows before pressing her fingers together. Release. Bakugou jolted as he was dunked in the cold water on his back. He shot to his feet and shook the water from his hair before jerking himself in her direction. Oh, you're going to get it now. Uraraka squealed in nervous excitement before bolting away from him, running through the knee-deep water. She could hear him splashing behind her, getting closer and closer with each second, and she giggled madly when an arm wrapped around her waist and pulled her off her feet. Her stomach was left behind as he lifted her up against his chest and fell back into the water with her. The water rushed over both their bodies, and she gasped for a breath before she was dunked under. She floundered for a second, trying not to break out in giggles under the water, but she managed to squirm her way out of his grasp. Rising from the water, she immediately splashed at him with both hands and ran toward the rolling waves, throwing her back and shoulders into it as she went. She watched as he gave her a cocky smirk and waded his way toward her, much more slowly than before. She casually moved backward, matching his pace, until she was standing on her toes, not daring to move another inch back for fear of losing her footing. Bakugou cocked his head at her, droplets of water sliding down his face and dripping off his sunglasses. You think you're clever, huh? Uraraka felt a gentle wave wash over her shoulders, and she smiled back. Maybe. He had stopped to smirk, but at her response, he rushed forward and snatched one of her wrists, yanking her out of the depths and against his chest. Gotta fix that. Uraraka was laughing giddily, but her smile faltered when she looked up at him and noticed that his features had softened a touch. His arrogance was still the forefront emotion, but the subtle tilt of his head led her to a conclusion that made her heart skip. She could feel his hands on her lower back under the water as he carefully lowered his head, and she sighed contentedly when his lips met hers. Oh, God! She missed this. The chilly water felt so good as it surrounded the heat of their kiss. Her hands slid up his arms, breaking from the water, to loop around his neck, and he matched her by pressing his hot palms against the small of her back. It was a long kiss, gentle, but in the way that a pot doesn't quite boil over. His teeth softly pulled on her lower lip as he pulled back, his sunglasses now fogged up on his face. Uraraka was left feeling breathless and unsatisfied, completely dismayed that he'd ended it before she was ready. She tightened her arms around his neck and hovered her face just below his, catching the slight glint of his eyes through the lenses of his glasses. I like this color on you. His hand slipped between them so he could pluck at the bikini string. You should wear it more often. She flushed bright pink as a wave rolled lazily against her shoulders, but she couldn't find words to say. All she wanted to do was kiss him again, and she was sure that it was written all over her face. Listen, his other hand against her back pulled her tight against him. I'm not one for breaking rules and being stupid, but... He tensed his jaw as he paused, clearly fighting with himself. I can't keep fucking waiting for something to happen. I'd rather take the risk than put this shit on hold for another day. Uraraka gazed at him softly, and her fingers played with the ends of his hair on his neck. So, what are you saying? He stared down at her, completely taken with the gentleness of her fingers and the content rosiness of her cheeks. I'm saying fuck it. Let's see where this goes. What about work? She was almost whispering, a look of adorable wonder covering her features as she caught the blink of desperation in his tone. She knew as well as he did that staying away from each other only made things tense and difficult, but he'd been so adamant before. What changed? Bakugou dropped his head down to rest his forehead on hers. He pursed his lips and sighed. I can't bring myself to give a shit about it. Katsuki. Uraraka smiled as she said his name. Just say it. He stared at her intensely and very slightly nodded his head. Be my girlfriend. We'll figure the rest of that shit out after the weekend is over. Uraraka pressed her forehead a little bit harder against his. You really want to do this? I want to fucking do this, he repeated with a note of intention in his tone. I want to date you, Kachako. I don't give a shit about the rest of it. Just dash, he paused as his tone rose an octave. Say yes. She narrowed her eyes teasingly, examining his serious features, and she tried to take a mental picture of it. She wasn't sure if she'd ever see him being so vulnerable and insistent again in her life, so she wanted to milk it for what it was. He was exposing himself to her, and it made her feel special beyond words. She never wanted to forget it. She gave him a half grin and freed up one of her hands to pull the sunglasses off his face. She held her playful smile as she twisted them in her hand and slid them up her own nose with a single finger. Once done, she gave him a smug smile and pulled her head back to view him fully through the shades. All right, Katsuki. Fuck it. He was momentarily stunned by her language, but he recovered in a blink. He recaptured her lips and crushed her against him, a desperation taking over him as joy took root in his chest. He had never felt more alive than he did at that moment. She had wormed her way into his heart and mind so deep that not being with her hurt more than all the rationalizations that he fed himself in order to keep his distance. He had told himself that he didn't deserve her. He had let himself fall for her only to force himself to walk away too many times. He had insisted that she would never be able to top his dreams, so why waste her time? He had watched her from a distance, admired her new strengths, and sympathized with her heartaches only to find himself denying that they were worthy enough for him to care. He had dealt with rivalry and blamed it on his pride, not his heart. All of those rationals were false. Complete bullshit. He had fallen in love with her, and denying it wasn't an option anymore. Kissing her now only confirmed that within himself. When they pulled away from each other, they were breathless and heady. Her hands were tangled up in the back of his head, and both of his had wrapped all the way around her waist. They simply stared at each other in stunned contentment, and the moment made them feel like the only people on earth. Uraraka was the first to speak, and she gave him a teasing smile. Hey, boyfriend. His heart leapt to his throat, but he scoffed back at her, playfully pushing her away and into the water again. Fuck, I knew that was a bad idea. Uraraka laughed and splashed a little water at him. Oh, come on. You had it coming. Says the one who's using the fuck word now. Bakugou gave her a teasing smirk. It was appropriate for the situation at hand. Uraraka shrugged nonchalantly. And that's rich coming from you. That entire confession was riddled with cuss words. Some way to treat a lady. Katuski. You knew who you were getting into bed with. He raised his eyebrows at her and tisked her when she blushed a bright pink. Her shock wore off quickly, and she lunged at him. All right, mister. Let's see you act so tough now. And their morning continued that way, avoiding the difficult topics and simply enjoying the newness that had settled over their relationship. They messed about at the beach for a few hours, but once the afternoon hit, the sun felt like it was sucking up their life force. They packed up their things and headed away from the beach, but Uraraka caught sight of a few street vendors in a tiny downtown area that was a few blocks away from Bakugou's family home. She asked sweetly if they could go look, and after quite a bit of back and forth, Bakugou relented and begrudgingly followed after her. They window shopped for hours, and he learned a lot more than he anticipated about her. She was astonishingly frugal and disciplined when it came to frivolous things. He'd been to her apartment plenty of times, and he simply figured that all the trinkets and decorations she had were impulse buys, but that was hardly the case at all. She was extremely particular about her purchases, and when something caught her eye, she'd turn to him and say, "This one has the sparkle factor." Then, she'd hold on to it until she found something she liked better, or she changed her mind and put the item back. Out of all the hours of shopping and switching between items that had the so-called sparkle factor, Uraraka left with just a single thing. "I like it," she announced as she observed him. Bakugou frowned back at her. "I don't wear shit like this, round face." "You do now," she smirked to herself, proud that she had channeled her inner Mina to convince him that it really did look good on him. Bakugou glanced at the mirror in the shop. My mother would have a field day with this." Uraraka shook her head at him. "I think she'd like it too." The blonde had never been the type to wear hats, but the longer he observed himself in the mirror, the more he warmed up to the idea. Uraraka had already purchased the red snapback hat before he even knew her plan, and due to her diligent frugality, he had been roped into the scheme before he even had the opportunity to protest it. He couldn't exactly say no after she had gotten him a gift. "I look like a fuck boy," he grumbled to himself, but his scowl didn't hold. Uraraka giggled. "You don't have to wear it if you don't like it." She stepped up beside him and pulled down on the rim so it covered his eyes, but it doesn't hurt to shake things up sometimes. "I think it suits you." "What exactly is your opinion of me, then?" He batted her hand away so he could push the hat back up. A few tufts of blonde hair sprung out from under the brim of the hat, giving him a breathlessly sexy, boyish look. It paired oh so well with his black tank top and swim trunks. Uraraka pulled the hat off him regretfully and showed him the front of it. "Look at it. It's cool." He glanced down at it and couldn't help but feel a reluctant appreciation seep onto his face. The damn thing had Plus Ultra in bold white letters across it with a fist embroidered in behind it. It was cliché at best, but it really didn't look terrible on him. "If you won't wear it, then I dash." "I'll wear the damn thing." Bakugou grabbed it back from her and slid it back over his head, this time backward. A bundle of blonde spikes sprung out through the gap, and he gave her a miffed look. "But my mother can never know." "Deal?" Uraraka gave him a playful smile and stood up on her tiptoes to give him a swift peck on the lips. She reveled in the dumb look on his face before she twirled away from him. "I'm getting hungry. Should we get dinner?" He shrugged. "Yeah, whatever." He didn't feel like owning up to the fact that he'd preoccupied himself while she shopped by picking out a spot for dinner. "I think I know a place." "Is it good?" Uraraka glanced over her shoulder as she pushed the door to the shop open and led the way back to the street, the bell on the door jingling happily at the movement. "No," he gave her a miffed look. "It's shitty." Uraraka huffed but smiled despite it. "You know what I mean." "Come on." He shrugged the backpack up his shoulders a little bit higher before he snatched her hand. He didn't look down at her, but he knew that she was surely bursting with childish energy at his bold move. He could tell enough by the way she squeezed her fingers around his hand. The sun was getting ready to set as he pulled her through the Shamlai downtown area. Restaurants were beginning to fill with people, but he walked past all of them, heading directly toward the beach. Once they reached the end of the sidewalk, there was one restaurant left, and it had an outdoor patio with twinkling lights hanging overhead. It was clearly a high-dollar establishment. "Oh, Katsuki." Uraraka spoke up hesitantly. "This place looks dash." "I'm buying." He cut her off and gripped her hand tighter, so she couldn't squirm away. "And for fuck's sake, kachako, don't skimp on me. Get whatever you want." Uraraka swallowed nervously as she was pulled all the way up to the hostess post. The two spoke briefly before the hostess pulled up the reservation and showed them inside. When had he made the reservation?
Who was this man?
After only a single day of officially dating Katsuki Bakugou, he was already touting out his gentlemanly side and treating her to a fancy dinner. All she had done was buy him a dorky hat. "Oi." Bakugou broke her train of thought. "I know what you're fucking thinking and quit that shit." Uraraka immediately looked up to meet his intense gaze. "I don't know what you mean." "I'm doing this to celebrate." He shook his head at her. "Don't read into it too much. We started dating today, so I think that warrants dinner." He raised his brows at her to emphasize that his point was inarguable. "And I'm the boyfriend, so that means I'm buying tonight. You can get the next one, deal?" Deal, Uraraka muttered back, completely entranced by his intimidating gaze. They reached their table, and her breath was knocked out of her lungs when she was met with the view. Just beyond the elegant railing beside their small table was the ocean, roaring with the evening tide. It hugged the shoreline close to their spot, and the first signs of sunset were pinking the sky. You going to sit or what? Bakugou asked from beside her. She blinked and shook herself out of her trance. Oh, why yeah, I am. She flushed and sunk down into the fancy patio chair. She gazed down at the stylish menu and realized that he'd brought her to a fine sushi establishment. Bakugou took his seat after her and watched her carefully as she flipped open the menu to look. An array of emotions crossed her face, and he tried to catalog them as they happened. At first, she looked shy, but that gave way to excitement as she scanned the different types of sushi. After a minute or so of her glancing over the many options, a ghost of a frown set on her lips in obvious guilt. Kachako, Bakugou blinked amusedly at her. I'm serious. Get whatever you want. But dash. Don't start that shit right now. Bakugou finally looked away from her and fingered his own menu open. If you get the cheapest thing on the menu, we're going to have words about it later. Uraraka gave him a puzzled look but flushed when he gave her a suggestive gaze over the top of his menu. She immediately propped her own copy up so that it covered her face, and she fought against outwardly squealing in embarrassment. Boyfriend Katsuki was a totally new kind of sexy, and he had gotten comfortable fast. And that hat certainly wasn't helping. All it was doing was giving him a boyish charm. Yeah, it was money well spent, but it was certainly working against her right now. After a lot of back and forth, Uraraka relented and picked out something she would actually enjoy off the menu. It appeased him, and she was getting a delicious dinner out of it. She'd get her chance to get back at him soon enough. She was sure. As they waited for their food, they both found themselves watching the sunset slowly creeping down the sky. Their conversation had fizzled into a comfortable silence, and Uraraka allowed herself to savor the moment. Bakugou gave her a side glance every so often, and it did nothing but make him feel accomplished. When he first started planning the trip, he'd eaten himself up with worry that they'd get all the way there for her to simply shoot him down. He'd stressed about it all the way to the moment that he picked her up from her apartment, but once he saw her, he knew that it would work out. He'd done all the legwork, and he knew full well that she was as tired as he was about putting off their feelings. Oh. He cleared his throat and spoke quietly. I know I said we were going to figure all the other shit out once we got back, but dash. No. Uraraka shook her head and turned to look at him. It's okay. Let's talk about it now. He clenched his jaw as he searched her expression, and his eyes lingered on the slight sunburn on her nose. I don't think we should tell Ed Shot. At least, not quite yet. Uraraka skewed her mouth thoughtfully. Okay, I can go along with that. I think we need to come up with a plan first. Bakugou leaned back in his chair and tilted his head to watch her reaction. And since we both want to be on the Viper case, we're going to have to decide what to do about that, and us. Going into battle together. He trailed off as he recalled the confrontation with Teller. You need to get your quirk back up to par, and I need to keep my head in the game. Yeah. Uraraka breathed and deflated. I've made a lot of progress, but my ultimate moves just aren't quite there yet. Bakugou shrugged as he crossed his arms over his chest. Another reason to keep this to ourselves for now. If we're at the agency together, then we can train together and get you up to speed. Maybe we can even work on a combo. Uraraka met his gaze and felt inclined to agree with him, but the looming possibilities still clouded her judgment. I agree with you, I really do, but we have to prepare ourselves because if Etshot finds out dash, he's not going to find out. Bakugou breathed the words out slowly, he won't. But if he does, Uraraka cut in again with a little bit more forcefulness in her tone. What do we do? Bakugou took a deep breath and contemplated. Come clean, I guess. Fuck, there aren't many other options unless one of us transfers. Uraraka leaned forward and gave him a helpless look. Well, we've already talked about it a few times. Mina's agency has an opening, and I could always dash. Kachako. Bakugou's tone evened out to a low and serious note. You almost died trying to bring Viper in. If either of us gets to stay on the Viper case, it's you. What? Uraraka scrunched her eyebrows in confusion. Well, you almost died bringing in Teller, so that's not exactly a strong argument, Katsuki. I did not, he scoffed at her, completely taken aback by her bluntness. Uraraka tossed him a sassy look. I talked to Ito on Wednesday, and he told me everything. Tisich, Bakugou shook his head. You should know by now that anything that comes out of Speck's mouth is shit. He's exaggerating. Is he? Uraraka jutted out her chin with a knowing smile. Bakugou narrowed his eyes at her, but decided not to pursue that any further. It doesn't fucking matter. What matters is us. Uraraka pressed her back against the chair and motioned for him to continue, watching as he sighed and pressed the topic. It's short term. Bakugou's tone was much more relaxed now. A few weeks and I'll transfer out. I just need time to find an agency that suits me. Uraraka lifted up her glass of water and took a ginger sip before nodding. Okay, but if you don't find one or you have to start looking outside of Tokyo, then I'll take the position at Mina's agency. She lifted a finger when he opened his mouth to protest. That is my condition. He frowned at her before reluctantly nodding. Whatever, fine. I just don't want to lie for too long. Uraraka turned her gaze out to the ocean. I want to be able to go out in public with you and stuff. And, at some point, I want to tell Mina. She glanced back at him to gauge his response to telling Mina. His expression didn't budge, because he understood. Keeping their relationship a secret would only make things difficult for them both, but it was much easier than not dating at all. Fine. Let's drop it for now. He conceded and followed her gaze out to the ocean. Their dinner after that was pleasant and full of teasing. The food was spectacular, and while neither one of them wanted to say it, they dreaded the day's end. The conversation was great, the weather was perfect, and every moment was full of mirth at their new relationship. They simply enjoyed each other's company and didn't want the day or their trip to end. They found themselves sitting on the sand again by the time the sun was almost gone. The sky was an astonishing view alone, but its reflection on the water made the whole world feel rosy and warm. Different shades of red, orange, purple, and blue made them both quiet as Uraraka rested her head on his shoulder and admired it. Bakugou didn't move his head, but his eyes glanced down at the top of hers. Damn it, round face. I don't know how you fucking did this to me. Did what? She asked, and pulled her head up to give him an odd look. He frowned at her. You made me soft. She stared back dumbly before she broke out into a disbelieving laugh. What do you mean? Bakugou blinked at her, a scowl threatening his features. Look at me. You can't tell me that I'm still an asshole to you. Oh, you certainly are. Uraraka rolled her eyes, but in a cute way. Bakugou groaned and flopped back in the sand, throwing his arms out to his sides. See what I fucking mean? A few months ago, I probably would have murdered you for calling me Dash. He spit out the next word like it was poison. Cute. But you are. Uraraka poked his side and it caused him to jolt. You're super cute and thoughtful and you're already an amazing boyfriend. Fucking stop. Bakugou cupped his hands over his ears and groaned again. You're never allowed to say that shit in front of another living person for as long as we live, got it? Uraraka sank down on the sand beside him on her stomach. She weaseled her way in beside him and puffed up her cheeks. I promise. He turned his head to look at her, checking her eyes for sincerity. Good, because if you do, you're going to pay big time. Got it? I promised, didn't I? Uraraka giggled and tilted her head jokingly. Bakugou huffed out a sigh before rolling on his side and pressing his lips against hers. Instinctively, she scooted closer to him and hummed happy against his lips when his hand rested on her hip. They exchanged kisses for a while, sometimes pausing to admire the sunset and other times to admire each other. However, it wasn't ever long before one of them would initiate another round of lazy kisses. By the time dusk was creeping in behind them, they were sitting up once more. Uraraka had rested her head back on his shoulder again, and both of them were feeling rather tired from their eventful day. Silence seemed to suit them as they both replayed the day in their minds, picking out their favorite moments to recount plenty of times in the coming future. Uraraka caught sight of a few people walking along the water, and one in particular gave her an idea. She passed Bakugou a smile before she stood up and jogged over to a man taking a photo of the picturesque view. Bakugou watched her as she spoke briefly with him before turning around and hurrying back. Quick, Hand me the backpack. Bakugou hesitated for a moment before he offered it to her. She unzipped it quickly as the man walked closer, and she pulled out her purse, then her phone. She dropped the bag back down beside him before turning to the stranger and offering it to him. Bakugou realized all in one moment what was about to happen, but before he could protest, Uraraka was dropping back down on the sand beside him. She gave him a smug smile before turning toward the man. Say cheese, Katsuki. No fucking way. Uraraka elbowed him. Say cheese. Bakugou didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. He simply looked blankly at the man as he held up Uraraka's phone and snapped a photo. Want another? Maybe with smiles this time. No, we're done. Bakugou grouched and fell backward on his elbows. Uraraka rolled her eyes but accepted that even one photo with him was worth the hassle. Thank you, sir. The man stepped forward and offered the phone back. A good-looking couple you are, he nodded at Bakugou. You've done well. I hope it sticks. Bakugou scowled at the man. You got something you want to say? The man simply laughed and waved before walking off. Uraraka elbowed him again. He was being nice. He was being nosy. Bakugou watched after the man. Fucker. Uraraka opened up the photo and showed it to him. To always remember our trip. It looks great, doesn't it? Bakugou's eyes zeroed in on Uraraka cheesing in the picture like an idiot before he saw his own passive expression that really only made him look like he'd been caught red-handed. What the fuck kind of picture is that? I told you to smile. Uraraka replied back self-assuredly. But did you listen?
No.
I don't fucking smile. Bakugou shook his head gruffly. She turned to give him a pointed look. Not even for your girlfriend? His next smart response caught in his throat, and he looked away. Whatever. That's what I thought. Uraraka smiled victoriously before looking back out at the sunset. Should we head back? Bakugou took a deep breath, reluctant to pull them out of the comfortable moment. Another minute. It's getting dark. Uraraka spoke up softly, and a little bit chilly. He glanced down at her in the faux silk robe that went over her swimsuit. Her hair had dried into wavy curls, and it dawned on him that she was a stunning natural beauty. Damn. Maybe that beach stranger was right. He'd done pretty well for himself. All right, he grumbled and heaved himself off the sand. He turned and offered a hand to help her up, and she graciously took it. The pair took another long moment to admire the diminishing remnants of the sunset before they turned back toward the town and began a leisurely walk back to his family's vacation home. They talked about nothing in particular as they went, but the closer they got, the more nervous Bakugou felt. Once they got there, he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. Should they just go to bed like they did last night, or... He glanced down at her and remembered that she was still wearing that bikini under her robe. No, he needed to clear his mind and watch for signals, right? She'd let him know if that was okay, wouldn't she? Damn. How did he do this so casually with her only a few weeks ago? Katsuki? Uraraka's tone was light and inquiring once she noticed that he seemed lost in thought. Are you all right? He was startled by her question and turned his face away from hers to hide the flush on his cheeks. I'm fine. Uraraka wasn't ready to let it go. I can tell that something is on your mind, silly. What is it? Nothing. Bakugou's tone was a bit more insistent this time, but he wasn't expecting her to circle around him to see his face. She immediately smiled at his flustered expression. Well, whatever it is, it's clearly not nothing. She tenderly reached out and grabbed his hand with both of hers. What is it? He stopped walking even though the house was only around the next corner. He sucked in a breath and looked down at her. It's no big deal. Let it go. Uraraka looked all the more confused and she cocked her head, searching his expression as he tried to fight off the feeling of the back of his neck getting hot. Uraraka watched for a long moment before realization dawned on her and her mouth fell open just a bit. Katsuki. Her tone was scandalous, and she couldn't help the embarrassed smile that tugged on the corners of her mouth. Get you head out of the gutter, round face. Bakugou immediately bit back. She planted her hands on her hips. Like you're one to talk. He scoffed and started back down the sidewalk. I'm not talking about this right now. Why not? She hurried after him, trying and failing to recapture his hand. I mean, we're boyfriend-girlfriend now, right? Shouldn't we dash? Shouldn't we what? He stopped again as they reached the corner and turned a boldly inquisitive look down on her. She shrunk underneath his gaze and blushed. Why, talk about that sort of stuff. It was his turn to be cocky now, and his mouth dipped into a slanted smile. Sure, you can start. Duh. She fumbled for coherency. You started it. No. He shook his head and corrected her. I was keeping that shit to myself, but you refused to let it go. The last of the color drained from Uraraka's face as she tried to reconcile how he had turned this back around on her. Double. Bakugou smirked at her. Not so tough now, are you? Uraraka pouted at the tease and turned around haughtily, strutting down the street toward the house. Oh, don't get confused, Ground Zero. She tossed a smirk over her shoulder before sticking out her tongue. I'm playing the long game. He cocked his head and slowly started after her again. The fuck is that supposed to mean? Uraraka didn't bother responding or turning around again. Instead, she simply undid the strap around her waist and let the robe fall down her shoulders until it stopped at her elbows and lower back. Bakugou's mouth went bone dry as she turned in front of the vacation house and tossed him a knowing smile before she passed the gate and made for the front door. She teasingly flashed him a glimpse of the entire bikini before she angled her body away just enough to urge him forward faster. You fight dirty, Bakugou growled out as his pace quickened, and he ran up behind her. He dug into his pockets for his keys and pulled them out before he reached her. He deftly snatched the back of the robe and yanked it off her with a devilish smirk. Nice try, kachako. Oh yeah. Uraraka cocked her head at him before she reached up to her neck where the bikini was tied off. She wouldn't dare undo it on the porch, but she was self-satisfied when a truly stunned look crossed his features. Bakugou immediately shoved the key in the lock and thrust the door open. He threw the backpack on the floor inside and grabbed Uraraka by the waist. She squealed when he lifted her off the ground and kicked the door shut with his foot. Let's see how tough you're now, girlfriend. So that's it for today. If you liked the video, leave a like, subscribe, and activate the notification bell. And if you want to contribute to the entire story being illustrated, just read the information in the description below.